It's Christmas, everybody! Except it's not. It never really is, because I'm perpetually bad at actually releasing Christmas videos on time. But I mean, I tried this year, I really did. But, yeah, this one's a couple days late. Sorry. Look, I always take the hat off, and I like the hat, and I always take it off. I never keep it on. I always find an excuse to take it off my head, and I'm keeping it on for this one, okay? Because it's been almost 4 years at this point, and I'm tired of not keeping the head on my head. So we're all just gonna pretend that it's still Christmas. The holidays are a varied and diverse time of year, and we all seek different ways to recapture or resurrect this feeling in our minds. The Christmas spirit, if you will. For some, that's sitting around a fire with loved ones, taking time to soak in the atmosphere. For others, it's simply seeing the decorations be put around town in the weeks before Christmas Eve. But the one thing that's always managed to bring me that Yuletide mirth has always been this. Eat your hearts out, Danny and Drew. But the other great pleasure that I take during the holiday seasons is revisiting old Christmas movies. Everyone has their own favorites that they like to jump back to, but I think there's one group that seems to have amassed a massive share of the films worth talking about, even decades after they went silent. That being Rankin Bass Productions. Rankin Bass was a collaborative effort between Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass, which was formed in September 1960. Originally known as Videocraft, the company would go on to produce a plethora of content in the following 30 years of its operation, with films like The Last Unicorn going on to be cult classics. But they're best known for making a series of stop-motion Christmas movies which have become so iconic and beloved that they've reshaped how we look at the holiday season. I love these movies. They immediately represent everything about Christmas. They're so eccentric and fantastical that they're always a blast to watch. But most of all, I'm fascinated by them because they were my very first cinematic universe. You're understanding that correctly. Most or many of the Rankin Bass holiday specials are purposefully set in the exact same universe. There are Easter eggs that directly connect them all together, rhythms to how everything is presented which marks a consistent direction, and the intention was that audiences would come to recognize these patterns in the same way that we would something like the MCU. So in this video I wanted to go through a bunch of old Rankin Bass movies, analyze and poke fun at them, and to most of all point out all the small ways that they're all connected. There are in total about 20 to 30 Rankin Bass holiday movies, and if we analyzed all of those, this video would be like an hour long. So we're going to have to skip a few specials that some might consider classics, just to make this a little snappy. As a quick note, this video is brought to you thanks to our friends at Audible. Use my link, audible.com/Quinton, or text QUINTON to 500-500 to get a free book, 2 free Audible originals from a curated list, and a 30-day trial. Stick around, because at the end of this video, I'll be telling you about a great book that I want you guys to check out. The first Rankin Bass television special also happens to be one of the most iconic and classic Christmas movies ever made. Airing in 1964, the film was adapted from a 1949 song of the same name. As the tune was already accepted as a holiday classic by the 1960s, Rankin Bass's film gained a large viewership and was received extremely well, with the film airing on one of the only networks at the time, and becoming a part of the Christmas lineup for every year since. I'm of course talking about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. The story is about a tiny reindeer who is born with a genetic defect, a shiny red nose that glows whenever he's excited. This causes him to be socially ostracized from almost all of his peers, who laugh and jeer at what makes him different and force him to flee on his own. During his journeys, he meets an elf named Hermie, who is equally pushed away from his peers due to his obsession with dentistry, and the two decide to become independent as a team. They soon meet Yukon Cornelius, a prospector hunting for goods in the North Pole, and end up being chased by the dangerous abominable snowman until they break off the ice and float away to safety. They soon find themselves guided by the Aurora Borealis to the island of misfit toys, where playthings deemed too irregular to be given to children are sentenced to live for an eternity, never happy and never accepted because of their lack of a child. The island of misfit toys is something that I've been more lovingly perplexed by as I grow older. Why are these specific toys singled out and exiled when they all have very mundane quirks that are either irrelevant or easily fixable? Over the years, I've studied the film top to bottom numerous times, and I think I've cracked the code. The toys on the island of Misfit Toys are the only toys in the entire Rankin Bass universe which are alive. Even just counting scenes in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, there is no moment where the elves are working on a toy and it suddenly gains sentience. There's nothing to suggest that any toys off of this one island are alive in this universe. Clearly what happens is that every once in a while, a toy at the North Pole is created with such care and kindness that it just comes alive. And Santa must figure that sending those toys out to kids around the world would be kind of cruel for the toys, considering that kids are so naturally destructive with things they're given while they're young. So they just send them off to some island to live peacefully for the rest of time. This is a bit. I'm doing a bit. This is not a real critique of the film. So the opening sequence of Rudolph is pretty classic, with all the credits being shown on Christmas decorations around the forest surrounding Santa's workshop. One of these credits shows the copyright of the film, with the creators deciding to write out the year 1964 in Roman numerals as a joke, except they did it wrong. So instead of the letter spelling out 1964, it actually says that the film was made in 1164. Believe it or not, this minor error has made the copyright of the film immensely complicated, with most interpretations of the law judging that Rankin Bass themselves do not directly own any of the elements in the film which they created for it. This is why it's so commonplace to see elements of Rudolph used widely in pop culture, almost certainly without permission. So the next time you see a terrible phone commercial using characters from this movie, know that it's all due to the biggest typo in the history of television. Additional fun fact, you know how whenever Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is performed in public, there's sort of the option to do mid-song chants, you know? Like a light bulb, like Monopoly. People who do that go to hell before they die. Rudolph runs home to try and free his new friends from his nose, and in doing so he grows up and becomes an adult reindeer. As he returns home, he discovers that his father, mother, and Clarice have gone missing since they went out to look for him. And as he runs off to figure out where they went, a horrid storm begins swelling around the North Pole. Rudolph finds his family under the capture of the Bumble, and with the help of Hermie and Yukon, they're able to defeat it and return to Santa's workshop, where they're accepted as heroes and finally find acceptance among their peers. In fact, Santa personally picks Rudolph to lead his sleigh after realizing that his red nose is the perfect thing to lead them through the storm. When Rudolph first aired in 1964, it included Rudolph promising the Misfit Toys that he would tell Santa to save them and deliver them to children on Christmas. But then the original cut of the movie ended with the sleigh flying off without actually doing this. The original credits are kind of cute in my opinion, in that the names are put on the physical boxes themselves, much like at the start of the film. But the massive amount of children who were upset about the lack of resolution with this story meant that they later went and made an extended ending which saw Santa rescuing those on the island and deploying them instead. Right, this is a pretty well-known fact that gets spread around every Christmas. Most of you probably already know this. But what you might not know is that there's an accidental dark joke included in this sequence caused by it being made several years after the rest of the film. You see, in the original sequence where we meet all of the toys on the island, this character, the bird, is referenced as someone who can't fly.
How would you like to be a bird that doesn't fly? I swim!
But then in the credit sequence, when this elf is giving all the toys umbrellas to glide down with, he decides not to give the bird one and pushes him to his death. That right there is the confident wave of a cold-blooded killer. Given that Rudolph is one of the greatest Christmas movies of all time, it's naturally a given that Rankin Bass would continue its output from here, and that several elements of the movie would become eternally present in their films. For instance, these specific shots of Santa's sleigh flying over clouds as the orange moon illuminates their path would become a staple of these productions. Here it is in The Year Without a Santa Claus, and in Rudolph's Shiny New Year. In Santa Claus is Coming to Town, the people of Sombertown are seen replacing an image of the Burgermeister with a painting of this moment, and again in The Year Without a Santa Claus, Santa is seen studying a similar painting as he ponders if the modern world really needs him. Rankin Bass's next hit would be The Little Drummer Boy in 1968, and the 2D film Frosty the Snowman in 1969. These are both pretty important and fascinating films. Frosty because it introduces one of the most consistently recurring and instantly iconic characters in the run, and The Little Drummer Boy because it retcons that Jesus exists in the Rankin Bass universe. But the next movie I want to cover is Santa Claus is Coming to Town, essentially the holiday film equivalent to Captain America: The First Avenger. Santa Claus is Coming to Town is an origin story for how Kris Kringle went from being an orphan abandoned in the cold to a symbol of care and giving across the world. He's raised by a group of Kringle elves to appreciate the art of toy making, and promises that as soon as he becomes an adult, he'll travel to the nearest town and deliver to all of the children himself. Sadly, just as he comes of age, the strict ruler of Somber Town, Burgermeister Meisterburger, bans toys and puts a hefty fine on being in the possession of them. Nick meets a young woman named Jessica, and while she initially tells him off for his rebellious actions, when he gives her the gift of a small China doll, her heart is warmed and she eventually joins his side. If there's any movie that will make you believe in Santa Claus, I think it's this one. Mickey Rooney's performance as Santa is just spot on. So much so that he still holds the spirit of the character despite being represented as a young man here. What I like so much about the Rankin Bass Santa is that as much as he is a literal guy who exists in the real world, the movie also asks that you look at him as a representation of who we all should strive to be. Someone who's more interested in giving rather than taking, and who puts himself at risk for the sake of making other people happy. I think one of the most memorable characters in the film is that of the Winter Warlock. This character is illustrated as the ultimate villain of this world, a sorcerer who uses his powers to terrorize those around him. But after Chris shows him kindness with a simple gift, he feels his hate melt away and admits that he wants to change, but he just doesn't know how. Thus catapulting us into a song about how making the move to become a better person is as simple as putting one foot in front of the other. As is pointed out in the bonus feature included with most of these movies, the Rankin Bass films tend to be structured much like that of a mainstream musical. And in the same vein that a tune from Hamilton or Legally Blonde can really make my day, the music of Rankin Bass just gets me going in a way that's hard to describe. Literally November 1st, I woke up early and went on a long walk just so I could put on a playlist of these songs. Most of them aren't on Spotify. I had to play them off of YouTube. That's wasted bandwidth. That's a phone bill I'm gonna have to upgrade. That's money down the drain. But for Rankin Bass movies, it's totally worth it. At this stage, a consistent idea of how the company wanted to represent Santa Claus came into being. So much so that, from what I can tell, they managed to stick with two specific voice actors to play Santa from here to the rest of their lineup. One was Mickey Rooney, who would reprise the role numerous times, and the other was Paul Frees, who was first introduced in Frosty the Snowman.
You go home and write, I am very sorry for what I did to Frosty 100 zillion times.
And would go on to appear in such films as Rudolph's Shiny New Year and Here Comes Peter Cottontail.
What are you doing with those eggs? Well, you know they belong to Peter Cottontail.
Oh, why don't you stick to your own holiday?
But it's Rooney who would become most well known for the role. And his next appearance would be in 1974's The Year Without a Santa Claus, an incredible film which arguably has some of the most iconic music of the entire lineup.
I'm Mr. White Christmas. I'm Mr. Snow.
The film surrounds Santa suddenly feeling a loss of purpose and deciding to take a holiday just before the actual holidays, feeling that as children don't believe in him, they don't need him. Right off the bat, this film clearly has intentional Easter eggs attempting to connect it to the other films in this series. For instance, in Santa Claus is Coming to Town, a young Kris Kringle is seen exclaiming his intentions to build a castle, which indeed he clearly does as one fades into place. Well, the castle we see in The Year Without a Santa Claus is clearly the exact same one, except over the course of hundreds of years it's expanded and urbanized in a sense. Mrs. Claus, fearing a world without Santa, sends out two elves with the baby reindeer Vixen to hunt down people in the world who can prove to Santa that he is wanted and needed. But they're caught in the middle of a dispute between Heat Miser and Snow Miser, and they end up crashing in the southern town of Southtown. But Quinton, I hear you say, in Santa Claus is Coming to Town, which is clearly illustrated as the start to this universe, Vixen is a fully grown adult. And yet in this film, set later in the timeline, Vixen is illustrated as a child, meaning that for all of these films to exist within the same continuity, Vixen would have had to age backwards. How do you explain that? It's a movie. The Miser brothers are held so highly in the popular culture, and when you watch them in action, it's easy to understand why. They're just written to be very charming and witty in an ultimately timeless way, which was honestly pretty standard with these films. You so easily forget that this movie was made almost 45 years ago. I really think that with Rudolph behind them, they were making these movies with the intention that they would be enjoyed by new audiences for generations to come. Oh look, Charlie Chaplin's in the audience. I guess McCarthyism never took hold in this universe. The Year Without a Santa Claus was really the final piece in the puzzle to how Rankin Bass wanted to represent its world. Following its release, the reindeers and elves of the North Pole would be consistently illustrated in every single film as they had been here. And this would really be where their emphasis on maintaining continuity would come into play. The film would also arguably end what was the true golden age of Rankin Bass material. What would follow is an era which I like to refer to as we're out of ideas. Rudolph's Shiny New Year is a 1976 sequel to the 1964 classic which has Rudolph facing off against a new villain in a story themed around the turning of the new year. Now, as you'll recall, at the start of the original Rudolph, the main character was a child, and by the end he becomes a fully grown deer. Well, those at Rankin Bass clearly had figured out that child Rudolph is great for merchandising, and adult Rudolph isn't. So for this film, and every other Rudolph sequel ever made, they end up reverting him back to a child and gluing slightly bigger antlers on his head to try and make up for this. The plot of Shiny New Year is wild, man. I don't even know how to break it down for you. Every year, there is a human personification of the year which exists and ages as the months go by. At the end of December, that human personification dies and a baby takes its place, the Baby New Year. But this year, the Baby New Year has weird ears, and it ran away out of embarrassment because everyone keeps laughing at him. So unless Rudolph saves this baby personification of the following year, time will never pass and the calendars will just freeze at December 31st for the rest of time. But then there's this creature that's like a giant bird, and he's literally gonna die in January, so he's trying to steal the baby to stop time from passing. So Rudolph has to cross the archipelago of time, which is an endless set of islands which saves copies of former years to live in eternity. Rudolph has to fight across various years to save the Baby New Year so that 1965 will happen, I think. And along the way, he meets numerous allies that help him in this journey, including Benjamin Franklin, a knight, and a clock whale. So if you can't tell, this is the greatest movie of all time, and I applaud everyone involved for making it. A big theme of Rankin Bass holiday specials is that if it doesn't say Christmas on the tin, it's still going to be a Christmas movie in some way. Take Here Comes Peter Cottontail, a movie about the newly appointed Easter Bunny accidentally sleeping through Easter and failing to deliver eggs to all the people in the world who would need eggs. He's really stressed about this, but then Conan O'Brien shows up and he has a friend that's a caterpillar and has a time machine. But the time machine is bad, so they try and go back to Easter, but they keep ending up in wrong times. Peter has a full-on identity crisis and ends up trying to become the mascots of other holidays, but he fails because he's viewing these occasions entirely through the lens of his own traditions. All of these movies inspired another holiday movie that all of you guys have seen, and at some point in this video you're going to start picking up clues to where that movie got all of its ideas. In this era of very subpar or bizarre specials, there's one movie which I feel is almost always overlooked, which happens to be, in my eyes, one of the best holiday films ever made. That being Jack Frost. Jack Frost is an origin story to the mythical figure who allegedly creates the winter breeze and brings snow every single year. The character had originally been featured in an earlier movie several years before, the sequel film Frosty's Winter Wonderland, where he had served the role of a partial antagonist. In this film, he is notably designed with a costume and appearance identical to the one that he had had in that film, which in my mind cements the fact that those at Rankin Bass were purposefully trying to convince their audience that all of these movies ran concurrently, and that their reuse of designs can and should be chopped up to more than just a cost-cutting measure. Like Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Jack Frost is a bit of an origin story. It's set thousands of years into the past, around a town known as January Junction. There, the community is terrorized by a tyrant who goes by the name Kubla Kraus, who constantly steals all of their possessions, leaving everyone in extreme poverty. One woman in town, named Elisa, declares that she's in love with Jack Frost to those around her, causing Jack to suddenly fantasize about living another life. You see, Jack's lament is that even though he's the spirit of the holiday and he's beloved by all, he's lost his passion and desires to try and be a part of something else. Being one of a kind, he notes, can be especially lonely, and having an ordinary life is something that he would at least like to try at.
The happiness of being me is not what it's cracked up to be. It's lonely being one of a kind.
Jack's boss, Father Winter, who might just be God, grants his wish, making him a human being. He has a chance to stay that way, but only if by the end of winter he has acquired a house, a horse, and a wife. But as Jack meets with Eliza as a human and is introduced to her family, he learns that Kubla Kraus owns all of those things himself, and that he has no chance of ever earning any of that on his own. Jack is soon joined by several of his other supernatural friends who have also been turned human to help him, and he opens a tailor shop in town to help out. Soon Christmas time arrives. Now, despite being in extreme poverty, those in January Junction still consider themselves to be a part of the Christmas spirit. So how do they take part in these customs if they don't have any money? Well, they take an empty box, and they pass that box around, and each person pretends that there was something in the box.
You shouldn't have, you didn't. Oh my, I really don't deserve it. I think I'll cry. It's just what I always wanted. It's perfectly right. It's just what I always wanted. A Christmas delight.
Someone got me a Christmas present. I wonder what it is. Oh wow! It's all the scenes in this movie that aren't super depressing. Eventually, the evil Kraus recognizes the beauty of Eliza and kidnaps her. It's up to our lovable main characters, joined by a virtuous knight from King Arthur's table, to break in and save her from his clutches. However, Jack is captured at this moment and is tied up in the Kubla's dungeon. At the same time, Klaus prepares his army of steampunk men to destroy January Junction in a fit of rage. Jack realizes that there's only one thing that can really stop this army and save everything that he's come to love, and that's a storm. A storm that he can't create as a human, but he can as Jack Frost. He sacrifices all of his hopes and dreams just to do the right thing and saves countless people in a silent act that no one will ever really know about. The fact that the movie is so bittersweet and has so little ordinary Christmas imagery is perhaps why Jack Frost is so easily forgotten. But I think the fact that it still manages to feel like a Christmas movie despite all of that is why it's so especially incredible. It's a good movie. You should see it. Alright, so there's one more movie I wanted to touch base with here, just to fully solidify my stance that all of these movies are set in the same universe. That being, Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July. A literal crossover special that goes out of its way to reference as many Rankin Bass movies as possible. This movie starts off with a long retelling of the entire history of the Rankin Bass universe, which retcons many of the elements of various films to have been caused by an unseen conflict behind the scenes. It would seem that long ago there was once an evil wizard named Winterbolt, who ruled the North Pole and was so vicious that no life dared live there, as he destroyed all who challenged him. This was until one day he met a force much greater than his own, that of Lady Borealis. Yes, it would appear that the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis, is actually a fully sentient and omnipotent being who takes human form to punish Winterbolt for his cruelty by sentencing him to a long sleep. In the centuries that pass following this, Lady Borealis leads the Kringle Elves to the north, as well as Chris himself eventually, both events which took place in Santa Claus's coming to town. However, one day the power of Lady Borealis fades, and Winterbolt rises from his sleep. Enraged by Santa Claus taking his place as the leader of the North, he plans to destroy Christmas once and for all. On this exact same day, Mrs. Donner gives birth to a healthy buck and rests following the event. Miss Borealis appears to him and gives to him the power of a glowing nose, under the strict condition that he can only ever use it for good, and that if he ever uses it for evil, it will go out.
Oh, what was that? Was someone here?
Aurora Borealis?
Aurora Borealis!
Winterbolt plans to ruin Christmas by making a terrible storm, but then the final act of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer takes place, and he leads the sleigh through the snow with his nose. A constant theme of the movie is that Lady Borealis keeps reminding everyone in the movie that, quote, nothing is forever.
Nothing is forever.
Which was literally the first time I ever realized as a child that death was imminent at all times. It's a good message to shove to toddlers while they're young. Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July is sort of the equivalency to the Avengers Infinity War, in that it crosses over a bunch of characters and then kills some of them. It's also the equivalency to the Avengers Endgame, because it then brings all of those characters back to life. The plot of Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July is sort of ridiculous, and if I set out to explain it to you, you'd gain absolutely nothing. So it should be said that this is really a movie made especially if you love all the other Rankin Bass Christmas specials, and if you want some fan service. It's really fun seeing Frosty and his family in action, but more than that I really enjoyed seeing all of the scenes with Mickey Rooney's Santa Claus. Because this movie is written to be set in July, we get to see a more lax Chris who is just spending time with people he loves instead of focusing on work. And getting some quiet moments with him and Mrs. Claus is really something charming.
And I still love you, just as much as the first day I saw you.
Instead of talking, you gave me a lovely china doll.
Well, giving toys is my way of saying hello and showing my love.
There's just something so satisfying seeing Santa and Mrs. Claus talking with the speech patterns of the Rudolph incarnations, but lovingly reminiscing about the events of Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Winterbolt is really a piece of work in this movie. He goes out of his way to trick Rudolph into using his nose to help guide a theft so it'll go out. He straight up tries to kill Frosty and his family by putting them in a situation where they might melt. He guilts Frosty into giving up his hat and thus his life by promising to turn Rudolph's nose back on, which is something that he can't do. And in general, he's revealed to be potentially the evilest person in the entire holiday world, and the secret main bad guy to the entire Rankin Bass universe. And here's the thing about these movies. The bad guys usually get off super easy. Kubla Kraus just gets vaguely whisked away, the Burgermeister just falls out of power off screen, characters like the Magician and the Bumble are given a chance at redemption, but the writers apparently decided that Winterbolt is so unambiguously terrible that they needed to murder him on screen in a horrifying way. Look at this. Okay, so she's like, I'm gonna throw my guns, and this thing shudders, right? And then, so now he's gonna die. And he just turns into a tree on screen slowly, just in agonizing pain as he's frozen in this spot, screaming in terror. And then you just immediately cut to these lovable cartoon characters having just been horribly traumatized by this event. But as Winterbolt is dead, there's nothing protecting Frosty and his family, and they all suddenly melt away. The only thing that can truly bring them back is a winter breeze. But with it being July, it seems like there's no possible way for... Oh, right, Jack Frost.
Had to go all the way to South America. That's where winter goes in July.
As a kid, this was my favorite moment in the movie because it signified the most ultimate and purposeful bond between all of these films. I had been rewarded for noticing that the two previous Jack Frost incarnations were one and the same by having him show up as the final Easter egg that the universe had to give. The Rankin Bass Christmas movies are some of my favorite to watch every year because they're just so packed full of detail. There's such a great difference between stop motion and computer-generated effects because it's so fascinating to know that what you're looking at are real physical things that existed in the real world. Dissecting these movies in order of production is additionally fascinating just to see how much the technology developed in that time. You look at something like Rudolph or The Year Without a Santa Claus, and it's charming, but with its faults. But then something like Jack Frost has such smooth animation and feels so flawless that honestly it would have been fitting to put it in the cinema. These stories have aged so incredibly well because they were created with a level-headed self-awareness, which means that they can and should be enjoyed by everyone. They employed world-building tactics which are still being used today, and managed to hook several generations of kids into their universe and their adventures all at once. And because of that, they'll be beloved and worshipped long after you or I have passed on. One other story I would strongly recommend for this time of year is the Audible original Twain's Feast, read by Nick Offerman. The book is a study into the life of famed writer Mark Twain, who was a man of notorious love for food. Each section details a moment in his life through the lens of a menu item. If you love Nick Offerman, Mark Twain, or eating your heart out, it's something that can't fail you. And you can get it for free today when you go to audible.com/Quinton. I've been using this sponsor for such a long time. They're perfect for long walks or drives when you just need to relax and unwind. And Audible members get a free credit each month to use on any audiobook of their choice. Those credits roll over the next month. And if you don't like a book, you can exchange it entirely for free. And as a brand new feature, Audible members will get an additional 2 free Audible originals from a rotating selection of content. That's exclusive content which you can't get anywhere else, which you can access by checking out the link below right now. But you'll have to act fast. So use my link, audible.com/Quinton, or text QUINTON to 500-500 right now to get a free book, any book you'd like, 2 free Audible originals from a curated list, and a 30-day trial. Get on this deal while you still have the chance. My happiness is a lot like this Christmas tree. I've spruced it up, but only the parts that I expect you to see.